Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new album from Frankmusik, titled By Nicole. Now, one of the very first video reviews I ever did was one that caught me by surprise in a good way, that particular album. The album was Colette Carr's debut album, Schizo, and while I won't deny that there were some significant issues with that record, it did showcase a real promising talent with a lot of personality. And the song from that album, No ID, landed on my year-end list in the top 50 best songs of 2013. Now, what's interesting about that is that that song didn't technically debut in 2013. In fact, that song was originally placed on the album of her main collaborator, Frankmusik, a synth-pop musician and producer who released that particular album, Do It in the AM, in 2011. Now, admittedly, this proves more than a little frustrating for me, but look, the song is still great, and giving it a chance to get it and Colette Carr some additional recognition and airtime, that's all a good thing. Plus, given the fact that Schizo was assembled from numerous assorted EPs released over a period of time and other assorted songs, I'm inclined to give it a pass here, okay? But you know what? What about Frankmusik, the male singer on the track? Well, after parting ways with his record label in 2011, he set off to make synth-pop albums on his own label, first with Between in 2013, and now with By Nicole in 2014 this year. Now, I'll admit I was curious. I liked the slick glossiness of his production before, he had a taste for solid melodic progressions, and you know what? He was a convincing presence behind the microphone. So I stepped up and picked up his new album, By Nicole, and I gave it a couple of listens. How'd it go? This is frustrating because you know what? I really wanted to like By Nicole by Frankmusik a lot more than I do. But there's a real big issue with this album that most people will be able to ignore, but you know what? I can't exactly look past it. As it is, it's certainly a pop album with a ton of energy and scope in terms of its sound, and honestly is pretty damn good all the same. But at the same time, it could have been great, and there's an aesthetic to its sound that feels more than a little bit misplaced, and knocks this album a fair bit away from great in my books, which I'll admit is really kind of frustrating. Now, first, let's talk about Frankmusik himself. And I'll say it, he's a pretty solid pop singer. He has a ton of energy and raw passion that contributes to a pretty considerable stage presence. And the fact that he can actually manage to match his production's power and volume, that's impressive. At the same time, though, he's not exactly subtle in his vocal delivery. And though this album doesn't really require him to be subtle on a musical level, it would have definitely added more dimensions to his vocal delivery. If I'm also gonna nitpick here, it's in his enunciations during his singing, though. It's not normally something I particularly complain about, but considering how fast-paced his songwriting can be and how his vocal production tends to have its words run together a little bit thanks to the auto-tune, it can take a number of listens to really pick out what he's trying to say, which can be frustrating at points for a pop album. Now, granted, this might not have been an issue if it wasn't for his production, which is large, big, booming, dense, and highly energetic in its presentation. Most of the synths are heavier and fuzz-saturated, allowed to boom and echo throughout the mix while still mostly preserving a melody line, which I liked. And with the inclusion of pounding drum machines, very crisp and shiny production, and an excess of electronic squeals and sounds throughout the mix, I was kind of reminded of a much heavier Euro-pop version of Owl City. And on that note, while I definitely appreciate the maximalist approach to bombast and energy on this album, I will admit it does feel very top-heavy in its presentation in the mix, and cluttered towards the very top, not letting some of the heavier sounds really develop some gravitas or swell in the lower ends of the mix. And I can't help but feel that tighter restraint and focus might have produced something more effective, as the extraneous electronic pieces, especially the chipmunk voice segments, which I just did not like, they could have easily been removed for a cleaner sound. And while I did like some of the varied instrumentation, the moments of acoustic guitar, piano, and horns were all greatly appreciated, I'll admit that, I definitely think that a richer well of real instrumentation and production that supports it would have played a little bit better against Frankmusik's rougher, louder vocals, which would almost be better suited for some rock music. Now, some of you are probably wondering why I'm so reticent to really embrace this album. After all, I've gone on record saying that I like bombast and this sort of power in music, and you know what, at the moment, Frankmusik's By Nicole might be one of the most explosive electronic and synth-pop albums I've heard this year. So why doesn't it click for me? Well, this comes down to lyrics and themes, because for all intents and purposes, this is a breakup album. And you know what? To be fair, on the surface, it's not a bad one either, as Frankmusik is actually a pretty damn solid songwriter. His lyrics have a natural flow and cadence that show some really good poetry. They're frequently witty and occasionally show some solid nuance, and while there are definitely moments that might benefit from a little bit more self-awareness, like on Stabilizer and Teacups, the songwriting feels heartfelt and it works for articulating some pretty complicated and awkward situations within relationships and when they fall apart. Sometimes in the breakup itself, sometimes in the attempts to move on, sometimes in the doomed attempts to rekindling the relationship, both sexual or otherwise, or just trying to stay friends, and sometimes in reconciling that your own problems might have contributed to the overall breakup situation. And you know what? When some of the songs step up and show that degree of nuance, like on Uh-Oh, Misdemeanor, and Conclusions, I'll admit it, they're easily some of the best songs on this record. I really did like them. But here is the big problem. While the lyrics convey a certain degree of nuance and subtlety, the presentation definitely does not, both in Frankmusik's vocal delivery and in the instrumentation. Simply put, if you crank every single element up to 11 and you go for such a bombastic, sweeping sound, you're inevitably going to be playing with a broader approach, which really does not support the more nuanced lyrics and really renders a lot of their more insightful or especially their vulnerable moments completely flat, as Frankmusik chooses to play up the anger and pettiness and melodrama of it all. And when you have songs like Crash and Burn and my personal favorite song, Call to Arms, they've got a little bit more of a simplistic lyrical style. They can work with this sort of song, but most of this album really demands depth in the presentation that just isn't there. And considering we don't get many of those quiet, vulnerable moments where he shows grief or sadness or longing or regret, the album can frequently get abrasive and honestly a little bit whiny at points. Teacups, for instance, is a song where Frankmusik describes a breakup where they split up mutually because they tend to blow up little things into big arguments. But does he not see how his song here is taking the exact same sort of approach? And while this album does go through a bit of a dramatic arc and ends on one of the more understated tracks on These Streets, which really has a good instrumentation, I like that, it still feels really kind of angry and bitter. It shows that he's not over things, and honestly, that did ring a little bit sour to me. On top of that, there's a running undercurrent on this album where Frankmusik feels resentful that he was there to help the girl in question through some of her personal problems, and that he feels used now that their whole relationship is over. And look, while I get his particular frustration, I feel for him here. Look, man, that's life. And by continuing to harp on it once the relationship is over, it really paints him in a sour and kind of immature light, and I didn't like that. So you know what? Look, I don't deny that on a certain, very visceral level, this album works. If you just got dumped and you're looking for an album to express your complicated, curdled frustration with the whole situation of it all, this album would be pretty damn effective in realizing that. But at the same time, with the presentation's focus in that direction to the neglect of others, it makes the album lose some degree of dimension and nuance, which, to be fair, you can kind of expect a lack of dimension in pop music, but I have the feeling if he had gone a little bit further there, this album could have been something special, which is a real shame because while I won't say that the maximalist Euro pop production is entirely my thing, it's done pretty well on this album with some solid melody lines, some great songwriting, and a really potent performance from a song lead singer, which is enough to honestly knock it up to a 7 out of 10 for me. I wish I could say that By Nicole by Frankmusik is great, but you know what? As it is, it's worth checking out. So if you're curious, go ahead and give it a listen. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums coming out this year that you'd like me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. So until then, I'm Mark. I'll see you next time.